So a quick word on differentiation when we're teaching this long U sound. One thing that we tend to generally do when we're approaching spelling from a phoneme to grapheme correspondence, which is a great way to do it, is we tend to give, let's say we're learning the U sound, and we think, oh, well, these children in my class are more capable, so I'm just going to give them harder words, longer words that contain that spelling pattern. So, for example, I might give the lower group few, but then I'll give the harder group curfew, for example. Now, if you think about it, if the children are at the point of learning how to spell the U sound, there is no reason why everyone can't be working with these easier words, because the focus is on learning the way to represent the U sound, okay? And understanding where that U is occurring and what the spelling pattern is. Now, if we assume that the children know this, then it kind of doesn't make sense just to give them more complex words. Now, this one isn't too tricky, but what I often see in these lists is the list for the higher group. The words might contain that phoneme and grapheme that we're looking at, but the words are actually so complex in terms of their meaning and their syllabic and morphemic structure that we're kind of setting up those kids to rote learn, which is not what we want them to do. If the children get this spelling pattern and they know this, there's a few different things that we can do to differentiate within that lesson, as opposed to just giving them harder words. Because often if you look at the list of harder words, conceptually they might be too tricky for the children, and they've got other things going on that require attention, okay? If a child already knows this EW for the U sound, it kind of doesn't make sense to be giving them this. We need to look at differentiation a little bit differently. So the first thing I do is be very, very sure that the children can clearly articulate the meaning of all the words in the easier list. We can't assume that they know that, and we want them to be able to do that explicitly. So not just say, oh yeah, I can kind of use it in a sentence. Can they actually define those words, not using that word and using synonyms? So explaining to someone who's never heard that word before what that word means. And you'd be surprised at the response to that particular question. So quite often students will be able to approximate the meaning of a word in a sentence and use it grammatically in a correct way. So when we ask children to use it in a sentence, we're not necessarily checking whether they truly understand the meaning of that word. So for those higher children, I would be saying, okay, you need to try and explain this word using your own language, but you need to explain it to someone who has never heard of this word before, so they could draw it, but the best way is to try and use synonyms or ways of explaining what does the word few actually mean. And I would think that children would actually find it quite tricky to define what does few mean in your own words. So challenge them to do that before you start giving them harder words, because part of spelling is being able to understand the meaning of the words. We don't want children to be spelling words or learning words that they don't know what they mean, because then they won't use them, okay? So we want them to then develop vocab building. So before I would give them trickier words, I might get them to do some synonym work. So what I kind of call horizontal differentiation. So we're still using the same list as everyone else, but we're doing some other work with them as well, because vocab work is just as important as the spelling. And then the next step would be, as opposed to just going, okay, well, here's some longer, trickier words with the EW pattern. So this is, I'm not saying not to do this, I'm just saying that we kind of stop at this point. So I'd give them a few trickier words, but still we want to make sure they can explain the meaning, they can find synonyms for those words, okay? So we need deep learning. But then the next step is going, okay, well, you know this spelling pattern, you know that spelling pattern, you know that one. Let's look at some other ones, okay? So let's look at things like the EU spelling pattern. Let's look at beautiful, for example, and remember that spelling pattern. And one way that we can do this for those higher achieving kids is that we can get them to read texts and pull out words from their text. So what they're doing there is they're really reading with a purpose, and they're looking and listening for the sound. And this is where you really get to assess how clearly they identify that phoneme, because if they start coming up with words that have the oo sound, then you can say, well, there's a difference here. It's not oo we're looking for, it's you. So they have to be very critical in their hunt for the words in their own text. But that's a really easy activity to set up, whether you're doing it remotely or in the classroom, where they pull out their own reading and they're reading for a particular purpose. So you're on a word hunt and you're looking for words that have the U sound, and then I want you to identify which letters in that word represent the U sound, okay? So that's a really great task for differentiation. So as you can see, there's a lot more than we can do apart from just giving them more complex words, which actually might require some specific instruction. So make sure that we're setting children up for success and really extending them and supporting them, as opposed to just giving them trickier words. All right, so hopefully you can use some of those in the classroom.